evening, everyone. My name's Paula Gerber. I'm one of the Deputy Directors of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law, who's organised this event tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. But I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. A little reminder for those in the 21st century that we are tweeting, I think is the right terminology, this event tonight. So if you want to tweet, the hashtag is CCKids, and I'd encourage you all to do that. So I'm really delighted that we've got this event tonight, and I thought I'd just begin by sharing with you a bit of the background of how this came about. I teach children's rights at Monash University in the graduate program, and as part of my teaching I organised a symposium on children's rights last year, and one of the speakers was a woman called Vanessa Zimmerman, who spoke about the corporate sector's responsibility for recognising and upholding children's rights. And we got on very well together and we had lunch, and she said, oh look, you really should meet this friend of mine, Rosemary Addis. I think you two would have a lot in common. And I usually take those sort of things with a bit of a grain of salt. But she said, no, you really should. So I set up lunch with Rosemary, and it turns out we did have quite a bit in common. We are both escapees from the big law firms. Rosemary was at Allen's and I was at Mallison's. We both are survivors of practicing as attorneys in the United States. Rosemary did the New York bar exam and I did the California bar exam. And we both are really passionate about creating positive change. And I try and do that through my work in human rights, and Rosemary does it through her commitment to social investment initiatives. So when we had lunch, our conversation was really dominated by talking about children's rights, and in particular she started sharing with me some information about this initiative that she's working on called Children's Ground, and I immediately thought this is something really exciting and that we should share it with the Castan Centre community. So that's how tonight came about, and it's now my absolute privilege to introduce our two speakers that we have tonight. So Rosemary is currently the Social Innovation Strategist for the Australian Department of Education and Employment and Workplace Relations, I think that's her name this week, where she works in the field of social investment, seeking to bring about strong social and cultural positive changes and outcomes. She leads a team that is working to achieve breakthrough solutions to some of the most challenging social and policy issues that we are facing. As I mentioned in a previous slide, she was at Allen. She also worked for the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet and the Smith family, and ran her own consultancy. I might, while I'm up here, to save me breaking the flow of the discussion that we're going to be having tonight, also introduce our second speaker, Jane Vadiveloo. She is the CEO of Children's Ground. She has a Master's in Forensic Psychology and a 20-year history of leading reform and service provision in communities experiencing extreme disadvantage and trauma. She moved to the Northern Territory 15 years ago and has a long history of working with Indigenous people, including in the town camps in Alice Springs. She's been involved in founding the first organisation based on Indigenous knowledge systems in the area of health and wellbeing, and she is currently on the board of the Northern Territory Council of Social Services. She is leading the overall design and development of the Children's Ground community engagement process, learning platforms, services and programs for each critical phase of delivery, and also the research and evaluation methodology. So the format tonight is that Rosemary will give you a bit of a background about the structure and the initiative, and then I think Jane will give us more detail of on-the-ground work with children's grounds.
Yeah, sure. Am I going to muck things up if I talk from here?
No, but you might. We are recording, so I might just get you to hold that. I think that works.
Welcome everybody, and thanks for your interest in hearing from us tonight. I'd like to add my acknowledgement to of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As you heard from Paula, my role is the Social Innovation Strategist at DEEWR, and in that role I work to the Secretary of the Department and run a small team. And the way I describe our work is that as an innovation group, it's not so much our role to change government as it is our role to use a position in government to work with people across sectors and across boundaries to create positive social change. One of the initiatives we've worked on has been Children's Ground, and it has been a unique collaboration, and I am really delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about it a bit tonight. I think as many of you will be aware from the work you do and your interest in human rights, that there are communities in Australia where the circumstances for the children and their families are not good enough, where people are experiencing entrenched trauma and disadvantage. I was at a conference this time last year, and some inspirational social leaders were saying, you know, when the stakes are high enough, there's really no choice but to collaborate. And I think in Australia we have a lot of areas where the stakes aren't quite high enough that we really feel driven or get to that point where we say there's just no choice. But for some of these communities right here in our country, actually the stakes are well and truly high enough. And we have taken an approach which I'm going to describe in terms of Children's Ground and its potential to transform the outcomes for these communities, where we tried to respond to that challenge. How can we take quite a different approach? So Children's Ground is the product of a unique collaboration, and it hasn't been developed as a government program. Our involvement came because some very experienced people from within government knew Jane and knew of her work, and when she was pulling together a proposal that really built on years and years of wisdom on the ground, combined with some of the directions that best practice internationally is heading, recognised that this gave something that was out of the stream of business as usual and approaches as usual, and created a space in government for us to listen. And really, when I first met Jane about 2.5 years ago, and William Tilmuth, who is the chair of Children's Ground, we set about a fundamentally different way of working together, driven not only by responding to the rights of the people in these communities, but also by asking some different questions. It's not like anybody hasn't tried to do good things in changing the circumstance, and it's not as though the people in these communities don't want fundamentally different outcomes for themselves and for their kids. Of course they do. So it was a pretty daunting task to sit down and say, well, how are we going to try and set out about doing something that might create a different outcome? And so it started with a conversation in August 2010 where some very senior and experienced people sat around and listened to Jane and what she had to say, and the experience from the ground, people familiar with the conditions in our most disadvantaged communities in Australia, including Indigenous communities, people with some experience of early childhood and economic development. And we centred that conversation around the question, what would it actually take? What would it actually take to make a difference? And we suspended disbelief for half a day, and we had a very robust conversation, a lot of which was listening with a different ear to what Jane had to say, and some of which was asking what I think were some pretty tough questions. And each time I go back to those questions, and I don't know about you, they're still pretty pertinent, and they're still the questions we test ourselves against. As a result of that conversation, we decided that there really was something here that deserved to be given every chance to be tested. And it was agreed with the person that I was then working with, Robert Grew, who some of you will know is very experienced in government, that we would create space within my team to try and incubate this approach. So we set out to say we're not going to develop it as a government program, and there was a large degree of consensus among people that if we set out to do that, that we would stifle it from the beginning. That what we needed to do was create a space where this work could develop and where we could bring together a robust program that could be something that government and philanthropy and the communities themselves could engage with and could take forward. So we provided what you would recognise from some other settings as an incubation type environment in which we asked hard questions, but we also created support not only through the resources we could make available, but also through creating networks and links and other things for Jane and others involved in the process to engage with. We tested the ideas against the international evidence base. We brought together the international evidence base and experience of others to say, how are we actually going to draw from a range of fields and experience, and how can we build a model around this that not only has the credibility of building on that experience from the field and from what is available in the international evidence, because we all know that not everything that works has actually been researched to a gold standard, but that has sufficient combination of strong governance and flexibility and longevity, but also the ability to adapt to the needs of particular communities, that you're actually going to be able to take it with credibility to these communities that have suffered such trauma and actually need to engage from quite a different point. So this is an innovation story, and it's a story about long-term change. And I'm going to let Jane tell you a lot more about what Children's Ground actually is and how it works and what the model involves. But what I want to emphasise is that this came about through quite a different type of working relationship and a different kind of engagement with an openness to learning between government and Jane and the team, which we've now tried to extend to governments at the state level and to the philanthropic sector and to the corporate sector and of course to the community itself. And of course we've tested the work that we did, so we went to Murdoch Institute and we said we'd like you to take a look at least the early stages of the work that we've done and review the approach against some of the international literature. And what they came back and said was that this approach is supported by a strong rationale and program logic, as well as a powerful confluence of the various streams of the evidence, and for the most disadvantaged communities in our society, it represents the best chance of achieving a better future. What they helped us to do is to tell a story that says, yes, there's no gold standard because no one's actually done this yet, but it's where all the evidence points us, and somebody's got to go into the territory where all the evidence points us. So this reflects the fact that the Children's Ground approach is as common sense as it is ambitious. When we outline the fundamental principles that ground it, things like start early and stay for the long haul, work with individual kids and families in the community, but work with enough of them that you're actually getting critical mass to create change. People recognise this as the fundamental common sense principles of what they know works on the ground, particularly people who've got a lot of experience. But it's very hard to bring together, and it's particularly hard to hold that space. And one of the challenges I'm sure Jane will talk about for herself and the team is holding that space where you're making effectively a 20 or 30 year play, and you've got to put a good day or a very bad day into that kind of context to say, are we making progress here? We tested what we wanted to try to be able to make available to these communities of real agency with a governance model that could also get people involved and be confident to give the kind of funding that it will take and to feel that there was the proper stewardship in place without creating layers and layers in between the work and the community. I'm sure that many of you have experienced firsthand the limitations of the system in actually being able to see what works, or seeing that we see what works and then we apply it only to little bits and it's hard to bring the whole together. So what we've tried to do here to create the framework for change is really to move beyond those goals that seem always just that bit out of reach and bring together the whole picture. So as I said, it's as common sense as it is ambitious. Trying to create that scaffolding that will help the communities make change for themselves. The fact that it was recognised by some people who've been around this stuff in government for a really long time to create the space to allow that to happen has been a major change in itself. And in order to be true to the original intention that this wouldn't be owned as a government program, what we did was once we got to a sufficient point of development, and that's always a delicate balance to make the judgment of when's the right time to move from planning and strategising to doing. We effectively spun the model out into its own organisation. So we created a not-for-profit organisation which is not owned or controlled by government. It has a very streamlined governance, which is company limited by a guarantee. And it now operates independently from us, and the way we keep the connection into government to ensure that we're getting the learning is through a community of practice which we've established with people from across government who can gather at regular intervals, listen to Jane, learn what's happening on the ground, and actually see how we might build that into other practice. And already we've had areas from within the department actively looking at how they can learn from the community engagement process in thinking about other things that we do. And people have actively engaged in saying, we want to talk more about place-based approaches, we want to talk more about this kind of governance, we want to talk more about outcomes-based approaches. And they will come to me and say, can you invite some of our colleagues from this area or this area across government so that they can be part of this conversation, and we can have that conversation with them in a way that we're not trying to actually navigate the principles at the same time as we're trying to get a particular initiative through. And so it's created quite a different space for that conversation, even though it's early days. This is going to be a journey, and it's a journey where we are all learning along the way. For Jane, she's running a small startup which has a terrific need for resources, a lot of energy around it, and we've been able to demonstrate from quite early on the potential of getting what we're calling a collective investment model of having the Commonwealth, state, philanthropists, the corporates, and really significantly the community itself actually have some skin in the game. But it's small steps, and there's a lot of work of bringing people on the journey, and a lot of people are impacted by the experiences they've had previously of working in these areas and the things that they see haven't worked so well. And so there's a whole process of building trust in the way of doing something differently and helping people see what that can do. Jane has brought incredible vision to this, but also I know takes very seriously the stewardship and custodial role of the accumulated wisdom of many people. It's been hugely professionally and personally humbling for me to work on this and for members of our team. And we're still at the very early stages, but I'm delighted to hand over to Jane to tell you more about what Children's Brand actually is and to show you a film. And then we'd both be really happy to take questions.
I'll turn up here so I can manage the technology. And I apologise for sniffling through this, I'm a little bit cold. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past and present, and the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri people. The Welcome to Country recognises that for the First Nations people, it's from the land that life relationships, responsibility and law are created. Ron Castan's respect for culture and law, justice and land rights led to some of the most significant post-colonial legal rulings in Australia. And it is actually an honour to be speaking at the centre tonight with you all. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to recognise, in honour of this centre, all of our brothers and sisters of all cultures and lands who today continue to fight for their fundamental rights to be recognised, and who suffer humiliation, trauma and genocide, living without a future but surviving in the hope of humanity, which many people here, I know, are dedicating their lives to try and uphold. So I started my professional life as a forensic psychologist working at Pentridge Prison. I don't know if many of you knew that before it was a accommodation centre. Over 20 years ago. And it was a very rich learning ground in practice law, policy rights, brutality and humanity. What we consider in the name of the law to be contributing to social good, safety and justice is, as we know, often a legislated and policy platform that incubates and legitimises cruelty and injustice. And I've since worked in the Northern Territory for the past 15 years and had a similar experience. Australia should celebrate our strong democracy, and we should celebrate a relatively harmonious growth into a multicultural society protected by a robust system of laws and rights. And that robust system should also give us the strength to be fearless in our pursuit of absolute equity and rights for all, because we can achieve that in this country. Unfortunately, we do continue to perpetuate outrageous human rights violations in this country. And Children's Ground emerged from that context. Human rights violators are norm, accepted as a matter of course in a system that's blind to injustice. But equally, Children's Ground has come from a context of strength and ability and possibility, and an energy and wisdom of many, many people, and an ambition of those people who are committed to changing their future. So Children's Ground is not about Aboriginal children and families. It is about all children and families. What is needed for our First Nations communities is no different from what all communities should enjoy: respect, dignity and safety. It was designed to work with communities in Australia that are suffering very deeply and very broadly. And we dare to expect the very best for all of our children and families, while ensuring that their local culture and sensibilities at the heart of what we do. So what I'm going to do now is just take you through a little bit of a journey of Children's Ground, and we'll take you through the model of Children's Ground, a small video of community. It's very, very hard to encapsulate something that's in many senses very simple, as Rosemary has identified, and in another way very, very complex and ambitious. But all I can say is there's absolutely no rocket science to it, and it is very, very common sense. We know that the challenge of addressing the global world is how do we redress entrenched intergenerational disadvantage. So Children's Ground was designed not just in relation to poverty, but when you walk through places like Alice Springs or places within Victoria, you know that there are places where there is poverty, and you know within those places there are places where there are people who are so silenced within that they are missing the boat altogether. And that's what Children's Ground was designed to reach to. Those people, those families who are the quietest, the most silenced within the system that we have created so far. We've achieved so much in this country, but it is at the fringes for those people who are the quietest that we really struggle to achieve absolute change. And really, to achieve that change requires absolute systemic reform. We know that people do not want to live in history, do not want to live in poverty, and we also know that what we're doing is not working. Many of you here would be cognizant of the dramatic statistics that face those who live in economic poverty and for Indigenous peoples in our country. The current service system that we deal with and that I've been a part of, so I see myself as a sector person working at the Grassroots for many, many years, is that it's reactive and overburdened, it has a short-term focus, and as a result of short-term funding, it focuses on people as problems, it doesn't focus on people as strength and people with integrity and dignity. It's fractured, it's just, you know, there's silos. Because of the demand, we don't stop to aspire for excellence because we're just struggling to find the money to put in the car to get the kids to school, or the bus service, or the transport service, and if you can get that little bit of money, you're happy. And so there's not a lot of time in that chaos to stop and say, this is not good enough. It's historically monocultural service-driven models, and there's not a lot of space for innovation because people are just working hard to get the job done. The services are rarely provided in people's first language. And I'll just give you an example. 15 years ago when I went to the Northern Territory, over 100 languages were interpreted in the Northern Territory, which is fantastic, but not one was Indigenous. It's changed, but that was just 15 years ago. And there's an absolute lack of voice and agency. So often the system is unjust, and it's underpinned by either current law or policy that fails in a basic test of equity and dignity, or from practices that have become entrenched because of a history of law and policy, like laws like Stolen Generations, which created services, infrastructures, approaches that have determined the way we work. And it's not to say, you know, the people in the sector who are my colleagues are incredibly brilliant visionaries, wonderful people who are dedicated, but it is very hard to stop and change the system in the way that it currently operates. So our development in Children's Ground came from the voices and experiences of fabulous people, Aboriginal people in Alice Springs, Central Australia and the top end. Voices and experiences of non-Indigenous people living with high disadvantage and who want a better future for their kids. People that I worked with at Prenchridge 20 years ago. But I had a phone call the other day by a young man who's next generation, who's going to court, who wants support. And, you know, it goes and it flows, and they're not seeing a change in their family. It's gone to the third generation of that family. And the issues aren't dissimilar to those that are facing many of our First Nations communities. It comes from First Nations knowledge systems. And looking at, as Rosie said, the international and national evidence practice spanning a number of things. Pedagogy and cross-cultural learning, including immersion schools, Hawaii, New Zealand, places which are at the forefront of some of these learnings. Bilingual education, which has been practicing on the territory for many, many years. Early childhood maternal health, healing mental health and public health. Innovation in 21st century education and learning systems, community development and social and economic inclusion. We've looked at some of the systemic approaches around the world, some really fantastic dynamic approaches such as the Harlem Children's Zone, and looked at some key principles that they incorporated to create whole of community change. The Finnish education system, which is championed amongst the world. We've looked at national policy and global imperatives and combined those into Children's Ground to ensure that we can meet those things, because many of those things come from a fundamental aspiration for rights and outcomes for people. And our Human Rights Convention should underlie everything we do. So our vision is for families and communities experiencing the greatest disadvantage to realise their aspiration for their next generation of children with their agency over their social, cultural and economic future. What I'm going to do is just move to a short film to break the flow a bit and give you a little bit of a context of what Children's Ground might look like on the ground, and we'll come back and look at some of the formative sort of structure that underpins that. Let's see how I go with this technology. People are leading a 25-year investment in West Arnhem, invested $7.5 million over the first 3 years to deliver a new system of learning, wellbeing and development for their children, families and community. Together we are working to match this investment dollar for dollar through corporate, philanthropic and government funding. By combining investment and funding from a range of sources, we can deliver a complete system of high quality services for children and families over the long term who need it the most. So how does Children's Ground look on the ground? First, the where. With the community, we create or support existing family and community learning centres as hubs of activity and social connection, places of safety and inclusion. Children's Ground and our partner organisations deliver a range of programs through these centres, into homes and across communities, where people live and learn in a way that works best for them. Secondly, the when. We deliver programs all year round, 6 days a week, day and evening, becoming part of the culture and fabric of the community. Monday to Friday business hours are not enough. Evening and weekends are critical times where support and activities are needed. Third is what we deliver. People want their children to be strong both ways, strong in their cultural life, in their language, knowing their land. But they also want them to be equipped to enjoy the opportunities of the global world. Our approach is designed so that children graduate into adulthood with this foundation. We deliver a fully integrated range of services across 3 key areas: learning, wellbeing and development, knowing that we must work across all 3 areas to create sustainable change. We have a number of teams that work together. Our learning team delivers an intergenerational learning platform with a focus on early childhood learning and development, literacy, language, numeracy, culture, making sure that parents and families are engaged and they lead the individualised learning plans for their child. 21st century learning principles are embedded in our approach. Our specialist educators are available in areas including languages, arts, multimedia, sport, business and enterprise. For all children who go to school, the extracurricular Our extended hours team will work with our specialists to provide a comprehensive extracurricular program for after school and holidays. Family health and wellbeing teams will work closely with our learning team. They will bring health into the home through first language, maternal and family health promotion outreach to all families. This team will refer and provide linkage to primary, secondary and tertiary health providers. They will work with our wellbeing and counselling team, who will deal with the grief and trauma that is so deep in their communities, as well as supporting families with parenting and child development. Our nutrition specialists will work with cooks and food security workers to support a nutrition and healthy eating program. Together, the teams will work with other providers in the area of alcohol, gambling, violence, suicide and other drug prevention. By working together with the community, these teams will deliver critical community and economic development through social, cultural, structural and economic reforms. Economic development is vital for long-term sustainability. Children's Ground delivers this through strong local workforce, enterprise and business development, and targeted training to employment initiatives. How will we know what we are doing is working? Our research team will work with leading research partners to monitor our progress. A longitudinal study will measure key outcomes informed by leading evidence and defined by the community at Year 1, Year 3, Year 5 and continuing across 25 years. This will allow us to refine, review and adjust to ensure that we are creating the change that community, investors and government alike are all wanting to achieve. We will know we have succeeded when the next generation of children enter adulthood, assuming agency and control, lifting themselves out of poverty, and achieving economic, social, and cultural sustainability. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about what it might look like on the ground. The critical work that we did incubating with DEEWR was providing the foundation and the structure and the strategic platform to achieve that. So it's very simple in many ways, but it's very difficult to deliver that across the board in a community over a 25-year period. So there are 8 key principles underpinning the Children's Ground model. Start early. Start with the little kids, start an early intervention, and stay for the long haul. So we hear about silver bullet responses often in these communities, you know, whether they're sporting silver bullet responses or mining silver bullet responses or whatever they might be, but there is none. This is about long-term intergenerational change. And it must work at a critical mass. So what we've seen for years is we have some fantastic programs on the ground and they reach a few people here or a few people there or a few people there for a period of time. But we're talking about a level of disadvantage that is community-wide. So if that community is going to have an opportunity, then equity and excellence and quality resources must be afforded to every single child and family over a period of 25 years. And it's based on assuming and recognising ability. I have never come across anybody that wants to live in a situation of economic poverty where their children are struggling. And a lot of the things that you've heard up there today, you know, I've had a response before, is this what people want? Well, every single component of Children's Ground has come from the voice of people that we've talked with. Jane was struggling with her kids, they're a bit cheeky. Or, you know, we really want strong culture in our family, you know, the kids need to learn their culture, and we'll go to that later. We want our kids strong both ways. We want our kids to get to university. We want school to be good. We don't want to be sick. Too much sorry business. All of this stuff has come from years and years and years. All I am, as Rosie said, is a custodian of lots of other people's knowledge, and I'm bringing it really as a vehicle into this systemic model for change. Deliver the whole, not the bits. So parts of this stuff is working already. We've got a little bit here, we've got a little bit there, but it's not packaged together. So where we've learnt from the ground, and some of the key approaches that have worked on the ground are these intergenerational learning centres, for example, where we've created hubs of intergenerational learning based on culture in some of the hardest communities. So in Alice Springs, if you look at Alice Springs, you go, Alice Springs. If you look at Alice Springs, there's town camps, which I used to work with for many, many years. We go, town camps. If you go to the town camps, there's a particular town camp that was very, very, very compromised for many years. About 12, 13 years ago, it was the only town camp where there was petrol sniffing in Alice Springs. It was where all the sniffers congregated. There was 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds sniffing petrol, generations of people dead from all sorts of violence and trauma. Those kids weren't engaged in any schooling. The local Aboriginal school, which was best placed, struggled with those kids. So we placed an intergenerational learning centre in that community at the request of those children. It wasn't somebody else's defined answer, it was theirs. Over 15 years, and within that town camp, there was a particular group of families who had the lowest, the quietest voice, who had struggled with this trauma for many, many years. Over 15 years of an intergenerational centre where adults came and kids came and flexible learning and responsive to community and respectful of culture, those kids engaged. The families engaged, they took agency across social, cultural, economic matters. Those kids hit benchmarks that were similar to any kid at any primary school. They all transferred into primary school with equity outcomes. Every single one dropped out of high school. So what we know is that we've got bits right, but we've never been able to get the early childhood platform into those town camps. We've never been able to extend it into the secondary school. So how do we look at these pockets of gold and make it a systemic structure? And if we can't do that in children's grounds, it's probably not worth doing, investing a whole lot of money for bits and pieces, because that's already there. So part of the ambition around children's ground is putting it all together as a whole systemic form over 25 years to meet the life cycle of that child. Innovation and new ways, thinking outside of the box. And that really goes to some of the 21st century education stuff, and to me that's rotating the wheel back to these Indigenous knowledge systems that reflect what we call innovation today. Expecting to deliver the best. For years I've watched, that's okay, it doesn't matter, it's good that we've got that. Well, it's not good enough. What we're delivering is just nowhere near good enough. It is not good enough that kids don't get early childhood in the most disadvantaged communities in our country. It is not good enough that they don't have access to adequate health. But fundamentally it must be led by community. So what we did was redesign on those principles 6 key systems: governance, services, evaluation, workforce, investment and community engagement. I'll start with community engagement because that's critical. So in any community we go to, so in West Arnhem we've been doing this for the last 6 to 8 months, we walk and talk with the community. We spend up to 12 months walking and talking with every family. Is this what you want? Is this the model that's right for you? We know in places like Alice Springs it is, because that's the voices in children's ground. A lot of the Indigenous people in Alice Springs, Aboriginal people from Alice Springs. But going to West Arnhem, is this the right fit for West Arnhem? Well, that is walking and talking, developing a relationship. Is there a shared commitment? Is there a plan? So that's the place that we're now at with West Arnhem. We've almost finished the community engagement plan, but it's a very critical process. But we learn along the way too. What we've learned in this process, it's not enough to walk and talk, because there's this tension between we need to be consulted, but we don't want to just keep talking, we want to see the action. So we have to plan and act in a way that's respectful, not going too fast, not going too slow, and getting that right can sometimes be difficult. So we go family by family and bringing the community together. In terms of governance, the biggest change is we would all be used to governance systems which are around committees. The Western governance system is about committees and elected representatives, but when you take that down to those who have the quietest voice, they're the ones that always miss out on committees. So they don't get on with them, they don't have their voice heard, they often feel excluded. So the very things that we think is good governance can often be something of exclusion. And where we've seen the best governance for communities of greatest disadvantage and quietest voice is where the daily users dictate the direction of the service. So you're capturing the gold every day. What do you think of that? You throw ideas about, people talk about it, you capture it, you hold it, you take it. You have committees, advisory committees, cultural committees, you test them out. but you make sure that you are actively engaging the voices of people. And you also look at your community and go, who aren't we hearing from? Oh, we better go over there. So you'll see something about Aquilia, which we've learned a lot from over many years. And the cultural governance. So in Aboriginal community, elders are your governors. But Old Way in Alice Springs, you never ask them to come to you. You go to them. Old Way is very quiet. Western Way is just the loudest voice gets heard. So if you come from a different cultural system where the most senior people are quietly spoken and you must listen and come to them, most of the time their voice isn't heard. So we've redesigned governance to make sure that it fits sort of both ways. The generational approach starts from early childhood, stage 1, rather than do everything at once. We start with little kids, intergenerationally, and grow the system up over the life course of that child. And you've heard the where, in family and centre, on country, the when, all year round, the learning, wellbeing, development platform, and how that translates into services. So innovative cultural-based learning environments. Family health and wellbeing in first language. Very simple, but it doesn't currently exist. Economic development. If you go into any community, you know what the economic opportunities, employment opportunities are, but so many of our First Nations mob aren't being able to exercise their rights into those. So how do you develop a learning system that allows people to be strong both ways? Well, you make sure you build it in. So the content of this will mean that a child enters, they know what their cultural history is from their cultural perspective. They'll know what the history is since colonisation to understand why things are the way they are. Because at the moment that people don't have access to that. They'll know what the opportunities are in their local environment, and will provide an innovative learning platform that allows them to develop the skills so they can exercise their right to access local economic opportunities. We'll know it's working by community-led, research-driven, articulating the approach all the time. So Children's Ground has embedded in it with the resources. It's very expensive because we've said from the beginning we need a research director, we need database people, we need to track stuff, we need to do it from a community perspective. And we need to look at things from the child, the family and the community. So we've identified headline indicators with community that we'll track. Critical is this economic and workforce strategy. So a lot of people here, people don't want to work. Well, that's just rubbish. It's about creating an environment that people want to come into. So our workforce platform, which is similar to where I worked in the town camps, is you don't make it professionally based because then you exclude everybody that doesn't have a degree. So you work from the strength of community. If we have an early childhood program, there'll be an early childhood Western specialist, but there will also be early childhood cultural specialists, recognised for their cultural expertise, not needing a piece of paper to legitimise them. And they'll work together to provide a strong platform both ways for children. And that goes all the way through health, wellbeing, development. So this is an example of how the labour force increases over time with Children's Ground. From day 1, local staff positions in green start from day 1, so you're creating an economic platform for people. And already in West Arnhem we're seeing young people say, I've been talking about, what do you want to do when you leave school? They're 16, 17, what about Children's Ground? Because I know it's a place that they can come and work and they'll be respected and then they'll be secured. And then over time they will train into those perfect positions. So hopefully the major economic base and employment base will be sustained in that community for generations. With funding, it's changing the platform of silo-driven. This is an example of, I used to probably manage 70 different funding grants for short-term program outcomes. Unsustainable. What we're looking at doing is going outside of government for our core funding. So we've got innovation, we're not controlled by a policy government agenda, but we share the space with government. We've got a fantastic partnership, but everybody within the government space agreed that that can be strangling if it's subject to financial control. So the innovation really in Australia, there's not full high-scale philanthropy. So we're going to work really hard. We're going to have to work really hard for a collective investment model. saying to all those people who give so much, rather than one person give a little bit to this program, someone give a little bit to that program, let's collectively combine that for greater impact in the long term. Over time, what we hope to see with our outcomes is to see the social, cultural and economic outcomes that will lead policy change. So the money will come into Children's Ground, will operate in different locations over a 25-year period, and we'll bring those learnings together for outcomes. I just want to take you now to the Northern Territory, which is where we're operating. And before we talk about what Children's Ground is doing in West Arnhem, I just want to give you a little bit of a context. So 72% of the Territory's Aboriginal population live on land outside major towns. More than 3/4 of Indigenous people live in the Northern Territory speak an Aboriginal language. In 2003, 80% of people who were apprehended were Aboriginal people. 94% of remote communities did not have a preschool. 54% of remote communities did not have a local health clinic. End-stage renal disease up to 30 times the national average. Hearing loss from otitis media can be up to 70% compared to 5% in the general population. Almost 80% of Aboriginal people in the central region had an income of less than $200. What we know today is 65% of kids, so this is today, go to school less than 60% of the time in remote areas. And Aboriginal women can be 80 times more likely to be hospitalised for violent assault. But what we also know, so that's a dramatic picture, and my life, you know, with the many people I know, is so much of what I've learned is from people walking through that trauma. And I get phone calls each week, and this week I had a phone call from a woman I've known for 20 years. So this is an example of her living history. When she was a child, she was put in the carcass of animals to stop it from being stolen. She's a grandmother now. And we talked because I worked with her 20 years ago when her grandchild was murdered next to her other grandchild. And that other grandchild is now an adult with her child removed. And she's now still living the trauma of all of that. And that's just a little bit of her history. But what is also true is people are incredibly strong, and they are alive in their culture, they are alive in their aspiration, they are alive in their ability, and their families want change. So what have we learned from the grassroots? So this is just having a little, very quick look into some of the work we've done in the last 15 years, which has informed Children's Ground. Here there is a place of cultural knowledge systems. It's an intergenerational cultural centre. It's been operating for 15 years. I'm going to read this out because this is part of the strategic planning work we supported them doing at the end of last year, which comes after 15 years of work. Young people need to learn what the land is called Naranda, how they are related to the land, what they are to the land, what the land is to them, the dreaming for that place, which skin group they are, who is the owner of the land and the keeper of the land. We've got to tell the right story. It is important to get it right. It has to start with elders, and if we don't do it now, it will be lost. Now that can be seen as a cultural aspiration, but that is the learning platform for Arnhem people. If those kids don't know that, and it's not embedded in their learning platform, then the impact on their identity, their future, their sense of belonging is seriously compromised. So at the DEEWR, elders have a very important place. We talked about governance. Elders make decisions. Old way. The committee take direction from the elders. People go and sit down with them. They're the teachers and they're the professors. People practice cultural life every day in Northern Territory, collecting medicines, preparing medicines. At DEEWR, they provide to the community. They create enterprise. They have their own doctors. They've been healing themselves for many years. They have 5 learning platforms with ceremony, land, story, painting, song, dance. They bring together families. They ensure that the men can articulate their rightful role in their community. And they're looking at old way into new way. How do you create economic sustainability and viability? Young people want to step up, and they want the old people to help them step up. And that's the reality of the context we're working in. And it's often the reality that's not seen in the Western domain. So what we've learnt is that it is critical to create places of inclusion based on respect. That delivering in innovative ways in a range of environments is necessary. Old way knowledge and practices have many synergies with what people can be considered to be innovative learning practices today. Cultural knowledge systems are sophisticated, and they're critical to creating and delivering systems that are relevant, deliver community agency, support identity, place and belonging of a child, engage community with their children and their families. And they are a necessary starting point for any effective learning, wellbeing and development in the communities we're working with. What we also know is people want their kids strong both ways, the best for their children. Over the next 20 years, these communities have articulated clearly that a child's community should be a children's ground, safe, exciting, full of life, fun, caring adults proud of their children, where kids know where they're from and where they're going. Healthy, happy and strong both ways. No more sorry business, no more family arguments and jail, less gunja, grog, gambling, enough money to go around, and strong in cultural and Western life. With a community that has respect, knows its culture and history, and has a social, cultural and economic life that includes all people. When we started doing some of the work in Alice Springs around Children's Ground, this is how Children's Ground was represented. This is how it was painted. So the strategic stuff you've seen was painted in this one painting. The centre circle are the children, in the middle, learning as groups, the half circles with the elders, and the single circles. The next round of circles are the families, and the kids coming in and out of the Children's Ground Centre back to their homes. The kids sitting down with their families and their elders around. And the footprints moving between families and community, strengthening the community all the time, walking in and out. The half circles here that have their back are the supporters and the funders, who don't have their back out of disrespect, but have their back because they're supporting them but not dominating and controlling them. And these are the opportunities, the footprints out to opportunities. The global world, universities, creating your own family, economic opportunity, but always coming back to the heart and soul of the community and strengthening community. So now I'm just going to move quickly to where we are operating, which is Children's Ground West Arnhem, which is very exciting. There's some of the board from Gundjeihmi Aboriginal Corporation, which is our partner organisation. Yvonne Margarulla at the top left-hand corner is an incredible woman who's fought a very long fight around her land. She has a range uranium mine on her country, which she would prefer not to have. From that comes a whole lot of economic income, which they are distributing across the region. And they've created a social trust in the interest of the region. They've just renegotiated a new agreement, and the social trust has made a decision to have Children's Ground as its 25-year strategic platform. So rather than a trust that's going to do a little bit of program here and a little bit of program there, they're looking at a 25-year future for their families. And they have an economic base to do it, even though that same economic base is causing pain and trauma. They've started social, cultural, economic reform themselves before Children's Ground as part of putting a system and structure in place to get the scale that we've discussed. Our region is located in Kakadu National Park, West Arnhem. There are 13 outstations, so it's geographically pretty challenging. Little families here, big groups of families there. How do you get to all? We've got travel issues, geographic issues. There are 17 clans groups. The Mirarr is one clan. We need to deliver to 17 clans. There's 3 language groups. Gundjeihmi is looking at funding half of the cost of Children's Ground into that region, and we'll be looking at raising the other half through both government and philanthropy. We've been doing the community engagement period phase, and we're about to look at implementation in around July this year, and that'll be very exciting. It'll include 2 family and community centres in-home, out on country, all year round as we discussed. Early childhood, we're going to have outreach programs. There are 7 incredible women who used to run a playgroup to the outstations. That program stopped because there was no more funding. They're not employed, they're experienced, they're excited, and they're wanting to do it again. Family health team, we've got partnership with the school, we've got a partnership with the health clinic. After school recreation, and the artists have created the community centre as an arts hub. So we ran a few programs over the school holidays, and it's continued, and there's a lot of energy and action happening in that arts hub. And economic and employment opportunities. So in the end, Children's Ground is a model for collective input, everybody working together in a systemic way for the long term, for a collective impact. It was developed with and by people living in extreme disadvantage, incubated by DEEWR, social innovation, and the incredible vision of Rosemary, and it's currently funded by the Australian Government, Gunjatni Aboriginal Corporation, the Northern Territory Government, and philanthropists and business. It is how we bring our collective best to the long term, driven by community, engaging the social sector, supported by the business sector, and supported by government. So I'll just end with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's a nice place to be. I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Okay, a very sobering but also stimulating presentation from our 2 speakers. Would anyone like to kickstart with some questions? Yes.
I'd like to know, Jane and Rosemary, how you decide where to go in terms of dry communities and alcohol.
So, could you explain that question a little bit more? Sorry.
Well, as I understand it, and a mass generalisation, but recently in the paper, for instance, we've been hearing about how some government department is talking about, and it might even be the opposition, talking about fining parents who don't send their kids to school. That sort of thing. Now that only comes about, in my understanding and in my limited experience in Western New South Wales, as a result of alcohol in the community. If the alcohol isn't there, the parents do send their kids to school by and large. And so how do you manage that in any community? I mean, are they dry communities up there? And if not, how do you manage it?
I mean, a lot of this is about agency in community. So, you know, at the town camp we were talking about before, you couldn't have found a town camp with more alcohol and other drug issues. But all those kids end up coming to school because we created an environment that families wanted to be in. So often the debate gets reduced to people are drinking alcohol and therefore these issues are happening. And for a long time, well, you know, back in my days at Pentridge, you know, where I was working with recidivist offenders with alcohol and drug programs, very few of our programs that we delivered talked about use of alcohol and other drugs. Most of it was about the systems, the symptoms that create that. And so that is about agency, it is about control, it is about creating a system of inclusion that people want to come to. And what we've seen is when we've created those places where people feel that they belong, have really clear rules about respect, safety, people come. Because people don't actually want to live in chaos that's driven by alcohol. If you look at even the stats in Aboriginal communities, less Aboriginal people drink than non-Aboriginal people. You know, half Aboriginal people don't drink. And yes, those that drink, there's a massive burden on those that don't. It's not an easy fix, but I'll give you just a little example of one of the things that happened in Alice Springs and one of the town camps we work with. This town camp, right in the middle of Alice Springs, with 3 alcohol outlets within 2 kilometres, and the river running by it. And when I first started working with the town camps, I knew that town camp, and they didn't want to have alcohol in that town camp, and they applied to become a dry community, and it was rejected. And it was rejected partly from the police and partly from the Liquor Commission. So we went on a bit of a campaign to change that. What was happening was that people were getting alcohol, drinking in the river. They weren't related to that community. There was a 2 kilometre law in Alice Springs, and we had a very good relationship with the police. The police would ring and say, Jane, we're about to enforce a 2 kilometre law. And all those people got locked up into the town camp. So we would go in a 5-house town camp to up to 35 people per house. Now, no child can be safe in that environment, and it wasn't created by the people, and it wasn't created by the drinkers in that community. We did manage to get it dry at the request of the community, but what we didn't have was the backup support. We thought that if it was legislated, then it would mean that the systems and structures would have to come and support that town camp to keep it that way. So often the national rhetoric about people not taking responsibility around alcohol is not what I have seen on the ground. Certainly we had conversations across those town camps where everybody wanted to manage alcohol. And when they had the alcohol restriction in Alice Springs, the town camp communities that often put up as the worst were the ones that wanted the strongest regulation on alcohol. But their voice isn't often heard. So my response is to always look at people's strengths and what people's vision is, and it's not to live with alcohol. It's to live free from alcohol and free from the trauma. And people are intelligent enough to know what that means. But really it's about creating the equity and the resources in the right way that people can access that to create change. So in these community centres, people come each day. And when they're at the community centre creating art or with their families or teaching or employed, people aren't drinking and people aren't. They're there with their families. And when the kids come, when the families come, the kids come. It's very simple. So we often complicate it, but it's actually a reasonably simple paradigm. But it's how do we scale it? So I don't know if that answers
it helps a lot. Yeah. I mean, do you make those hubs, those community centres, no alcohol allowed?
Yeah, so you just sit down with the community and people say, what rules do you want? No, I want no. You know, so people make those decisions themselves. They know what they want. Absolutely.
First of all, congratulations. It's kind of like an epic journey to get here and still lots to be done. But it's fantastic model. I just had a question around funding. And you talked about some funders have committed to 25 years already. Or not?
No.
No. Is the funding at all tied to specific outcomes being achieved?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in a sense, the community has committed to 25 years because it's their generational life. And those outcomes are the ones that we put up there. So we're looking at 25-year outcomes. So ideally you'd have the majority of kids in a strong learning wellbeing outcomes with economic opportunities, cultural strength, identity, all those things. And then we track those back, year 1, year 3, year 5, year 7, to make sure that we're progressing. But it's really important that the community undertake that evaluation for themselves so they can question, is this model right? Is this delivering what we want? So it should always come back to agency of community, not outside people determining the validity of what we're doing. We will have outside partners, but yes, tracking against those key outcomes.
And it's one of the aspects of the ongoing conversation about on what basis do you fund it, because as Jane said, it's fundamentally don't start to pull it apart and go, well, we only want this bit of room without it, but it's also needs to be a collective model. So that's something that has taken a lot of thought and still takes a lot of thought, and it, it makes the challenge, particularly in the conversations in government, to be honest, really, quite tricky in terms of how you achieve it, because the reality is that unless you could get something through that's specific, most things have outlines. And so taking people on that journey, and to an extent that's also informed the fact that we put children's ground out to then come back in and be able to have those conversations. And we've had quite frank conversations with senior stakeholders in government saying, well, we could send children's ground on its way and say, we've done this much. Or we can actually say we've started something here because we all want to learn, and now there's going to be a range of conversations, some of which are going to be hard, but that's what grown-ups do, right? You have hard conversations and you work it out.
I was actually part of the team from the Mirarr Children's Research Institute that put together the literature review, so I'm very excited to hear how far you guys have come. And I'm really interested to know if you're far enough along to be able to comment on how the community-led governance and recruitment of the services and systems that are going to sit around the children, family and community are actually operating on a practical level.
Yeah, look, it's great. It's challenging, like it has not been without its challenges. And you know, when you, at some point down the track, and it's probably going to be a good 10 or 15 years down the track to be honest, there's a very important story to tell about the dynamics of community and the challenges internally in communities. Because you're working across a lot of clans, a lot of languages, a lot of interests, history which has pain within the culture as well as across culture. So we're navigating a pretty difficult path, often. But in saying that, in the short time we've been there, the local governance structures are coming out. The people with cultural authority, the people with experience and practical experience on the ground. 2 weeks ago we get a fantastic partnership starting with the Vadiveloo area school. So Children's Ground was created so that we could have an independent school model, a bit like charter schools in the States, with the belief that really it can be impossible to create change within the existing education structure. But what we've found up in Vadiveloo is, delightfully, the Vadiveloo area school is totally on the same path as we are. They've got fantastic leaders that are wanting to do things differently, and they want to recognise the Children's Ground approach and what we do as legitimate within the mainstream schooling. So we'll set it up so that if those people come and go, we can be independent, but while we can have a strong partnership, we will. So they held a forum 2 weeks ago they went up to, and there was about 37 binning, which is Aboriginal people across the region from all different outstations. Again, a lot of the people we've been walking and talking with. And so through their work and ours, we now have a cultural advisory committee. So they've got a little bit of funding to establish that this year. And at the meeting, Phil said, and we'll continue this. I'm not sure we'll get the funding, Jane, but they can see Children's Ground as an approach that is supporting local governance and will have funding for the support of that to be able to continue that agency for local people. So we've got really clear identified binning people with great leadership and aspiration. We've got people like the 7 women who've done early childhood stuff that are ready to tomorrow pick up the early childhood outreach stuff. I think I was concerned about local workforce stuff because it's really critical to have a critical mass of people, but I'm not so worried about that anymore. That getting good people who can work alongside in a respectful way, because you know, sometimes we say at the moment you've got a Western or a Ballarat structure and we tackle, you know, culture around the outside, and we want to shift that around. So we start with this great elders, May and Mark Nango, who hold a lot of cultural story, who want to teach the kids old way stuff. And what's beautiful about those senior people, as with the mob in Alice Springs, the senior people there, is always reconciliation. You know what? I want the kids to learn in this way too. You know, we want to teach this to all kids. And so what's beautiful is the potential for us to create a system that is inclusive of all and allows everybody access to this cross-cultural rich environment. So all of those things are emerging. The health system, what's happening interestingly with the school and the health system is they're excited about A, the resources that could come with Children's Ground, and B, the flexibility if we have the innovation to do things differently because they are so tied to what they have to deliver through the health structure and the education structure. So they can see that in a partnership we might be able to deliver things differently. So there, for example, health has got a little bit of money for early childhood, which is one play group here and there. Education system's got a little bit of early childhood for a car here and there. And then we'll have resources, and together we will see it as a joint collective delivery of those things. So, yeah, it's positive. Does that answer your question?
It does, because I've recently finished managing the Linking Schools and Early Years project, and the one thing that, although we created some great positive practice change, the one thing that we didn't have was all those supporting systems and that bucket funding or community level funding where the community decides where and how it's spent.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to hear that's a key part of it.
Yeah, that's really fantastic.
I might actually finish with one question. I'm just wondering if part of the aim is to raise awareness of children's grounds, because frankly if I hadn't met Rosemary I would never have heard about it, I hadn't read about it anywhere. In fact the things that you read about solving Indigenous education problems, at least of late, has been to take Indigenous children out of their families and send them to boarding school. So I guess a two-pronged question is, what do you think of that approach? And is there a plan to try and really spread the word about children's grounds?
So firstly, spreading the word around about children's ground, yes, we need to do it, but I'm very aware that it needs to prove itself.
It really does.
You know, I was saying to someone the other day, we might not ever get the money, but I could probably have a career going around the world as an inequity expert. And, you know, truly, that's the situation. So we need to land the money and we need to prove ourselves before we can really celebrate. Now I feel confident because so much of the model we've practiced and we know is real, but I need to see it work too. You know? So yes, we need to spread the word, but we need to be cautious about the fact that nobody globally has redressed entrenched disadvantage. If we get it right, this has global implications. My sister-in-law is an Inupiat woman from Barrow, Alaska. So this, in a sense, goes to part of your second question. They have massive oil reserves. 30 years ago, she comes to Australia and she just bemoans the conversation here. She says, why don't people learn from what happened to us? 30 years ago, all of their families were taken to boarding school. So they've come back with lots of Western skills, all the same social issues. No language, culture really, really compromised, struggling with identity. And they've just started an immersion school because they've got 3 language speakers left. And that's where her child will go. She said, it is not the answer for our communities to remove them. And we are a living case example of a rich community with lots of money, opportunity, and still the devastating outcomes. Here in Australia, the cost of children's ground is about $50,000 per child. Per family, sorry, not per child, per family. So it costs about that to put a child into boarding school in Australia, where you're removing a child from their community and not shifting the quality of that community. So what we're saying is, if we got people to collectively invest in every family in the community we're working with, for $50,000 a year, that whole community will have an opportunity for change. So no, I don't think the answer is removing children. But for some kids, they do want it and families do want it. So it's a choice thing.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all feel very privileged to have learned about children's ground in such an interesting way this evening. So please join me in thanking our speakers.